The year was 1873, and the dusty streets of Blackwater Falls had never seen anything quite like the woman who stepped off the morning stage that September day. Nobody in town recognized the elegantly dressed lady in the emerald traveling coat, but they should have, because 10 years ago they'd driven her out as a pregnant 16-year-old with nothing but shame and the clothes on her back. Now Isabella Bella Rodriguez had returned, and she wasn't the broken girl they remembered. She was their only hope of survival, though they didn't know it yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach's wheels kicked up clouds of red dust as it rolled to a stop in front of McKenna's General Store, the only building in Blackwater Falls that served as both mercantile and unofficial town center. The driver, a weathered man named Jim Hawthorne, who'd been running this route for 15 years, climbed down from his perch and began untying the leather straps that secured the luggage to the roof. He'd seen all kinds of passengers in his time. Desperate prospectors heading to the silver mines, families fleeing failed farms back east, and occasionally mysterious women whose stories were written in the expensive fabric of their dresses, and the careful way they held themselves. This particular passenger intrigued him more than most. She'd paid for her ticket in crisp bills, not the worn coins and crumpled paper money most travelers carried. Her luggage was quality leather, the kind that spoke of success and prosperity, but it was her eyes that caught his attention. Green, as mountain pine and sharp as winter wind, holding secrets that ran deeper than the canyon outside town. Bella stepped down from the stage with the grace of someone who'd learned to command attention in rooms full of powerful men. Her traveling dress was made of fine wool, cut in the latest San Francisco fashion, with intricate beadwork that caught the morning sunlight. A small fortune in jewelry adorned her throat and wrists, not gaudy displays of wealth, but carefully chosen pieces that spoke of refined taste and substantial means. Her dark hair was swept up in an elaborate style beneath a hat that probably cost more than most Blackwater Falls residents earned in 6 months. The townspeople began to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of such obvious prosperity in their struggling community. Blackwater Falls had seen better days, much better days. The silver mine that had brought the town into existence was playing out, the yields dropping month by month as the easily accessible ore was exhausted. Businesses were closing, families were packing up and moving on, and those who remained clung to the hope that something would change their fortunes before the town withered away completely. Mrs. Sarah McKenna emerged from the general store, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with greying hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with every type of frontier character imaginable. Her husband Patrick ran the store while she managed the boarding house upstairs, and together they'd become the unofficial welcomers of new arrivals. "Afternoon, miss," Sarah said, her voice carrying the slight Irish accent that marked her as one of the earlier settlers. "You'll be needing accommodations, I expect." Bella turned to face the woman, and for just a moment something flickered in her green eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. But her voice when she spoke was steady and cultured, with the polish that came from years of practice in presenting. Exactly the image she chose. "Good afternoon. I am Isabella Vasquez," she said, using the surname she'd adopted during her years away from Blackwater Falls. "I understand you have rooms available." Sarah nodded, though her eyes were studying Bella's face with growing curiosity. There was something familiar about the woman's features, something that nagged at the edges of memory like a half-remembered dream. "Indeed we do. Most of our rooms are empty these days, truth be told. Town's not what it used to be." Sarah's voice carried the weariness of someone watching her world slowly crumble. "Will you be staying long?" "That depends," Bella replied, her gaze sweeping across the collection of weathered buildings that lined the main street. "I'm here on business that may take some time to resolve." The crowd that had gathered to observe the new arrival murmured among themselves. Business was scarce in Blackwater Falls these days, and the idea that someone of obvious means might have dealings in their failing town sparked both hope and speculation. Old Pete Johansson, the town's blacksmith and unofficial keeper of local history, stepped forward. He was a massive man, made larger by decades of working the forge, with arms like tree trunks and hands that could bend horseshoes but were surprisingly gentle when the situation called for it. His beard was more grey than black now, and his eyes held the wisdom that came from watching towns rise and fall across the frontier. "Business, you say?" Pete's voice was gravelly from years of breathing forge smoke. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but what kind of business brings a lady of your obvious refinement to Blackwater Falls?" Bella smiled, but it was the kind of smile that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. "I represent certain interests in San Francisco that have taken notice of your community's potential." The word potential sent a ripple of excitement through the gathered crowd. In a town facing extinction, any hint of outside investment was like water to people dying of thirst. Dr. Marcus Webb pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched in one hand and his hat in the other. He was a thin man in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the intense eyes of someone who'd seen too much suffering and too few miracles. As the town's only doctor, he'd watched Blackwater Falls decline through the lens of human misery. Families unable to pay for medical care, children growing thin from poor nutrition, and the steady exodus of healthy young people seeking opportunity. "Elsewhere, Dr. Webb," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "If you'll forgive my directness, ma'am, any business that might help this town is of considerable interest to all of us." Bella shook his hand, noting the calluses that marked him as a man who did his own manual labor, probably chopping wood and maintaining his own property like everyone else in the struggling community. "Dr. Webb," she acknowledged, "I'm sure we'll have occasion to speak further during my stay." There was something in the way she said it, a note of certainty that suggested she knew more about the town's affairs than any casual visitor should. Dr. Webb found himself studying her face, trying to place why she seemed somehow familiar. Mayor Thomas Brennan arrived on the scene, breathing heavily from his hurried walk from the town hall. He was a portly man in his 60s, with thinning hair and the soft hands of someone who'd never done a day of physical labor. He'd been elected mayor 3 years ago on promises of bringing new business to Blackwater Falls, but his efforts had met with limited success. "Mayor Brennan," he announced, straightening his vest and trying to project authority despite his obvious excitement at the prospect of a wealthy visitor. "Welcome to Blackwater Falls, Miss Vasquez," Bella supplied smoothly. "Isabella Vasquez." "Miss Vasquez, of course. I trust Mrs. McKenna has seen to your accommodations." "Excellent, excellent. Perhaps tomorrow we might discuss these business interests you mentioned. I'd be delighted to show you around our community, highlight our many advantages for potential investors." Bella nodded graciously. "I would appreciate that, Mayor Brennan. Though I should mention that I'm already quite familiar with Blackwater Falls's history and unique characteristics. Again, that note of hidden knowledge, that suggestion of secrets waiting to be revealed." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, eager to spread the news of the mysterious visitor and speculate about what her arrival might mean for their town's future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. As the townspeople wandered back to their daily routines, Bella followed Sarah McKenna into the general store. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves that had once been fully stocked but now showed the gaps and bare spaces that spoke of declining trade. Barrels of flour and beans sat alongside bolts of practical fabric, tools, and the basic necessities of frontier life. "You'll want our best room, I expect," Sarah said, as she led the way to a narrow staircase at the back of the store. "It's not fancy by city standards, but it's clean and comfortable." "I'm sure it will be adequate," Bella replied, though her eyes were taking in every detail of the store's layout, noting the changes that had occurred during her 10-year absence. The room was indeed simple but clean, with a narrow bed covered by a handmade quilt, a washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a single window that looked out over the main street. Sarah set Bella's traveling case on the bed and turned to face her guest. "Will you be taking meals with us? I serve breakfast at 7, dinner at noon, and supper at 6. Nothing fancy, but it's filling and well prepared." "Thank you, yes." "And Mrs. McKenna?" Bella's voice carried a note of casual inquiry. "I'm curious about the town's current situation, the mining specifically. I understand production has been declining." Sarah's face darkened with worry. "Declining doesn't begin to cover it, miss. The mine's barely producing enough silver to keep the operation running. Mr. Garrett, he's the mine superintendent, says they're going deeper, trying to find new veins, but—" She shrugged helplessly. "Most folks think it's just a matter of time before they shut down completely. And then what happens to Blackwater Falls? Then we become another ghost town, I suppose. There's dozens of them scattered across these mountains, places that boomed for a few years and then just disappeared when the ore ran out." Bella walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Children were playing in the dust, their clothes patched and faded, but their laughter bright in the afternoon air. Women hung laundry on lines, strung between buildings, making the best of their circumstances despite the uncertainty that shadowed their future. "Has anyone considered alternative sources of prosperity?" Bella asked. "Other industries that might sustain the community?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Miss Vasquez, we're 100 miles from the nearest railroad, surrounded by mountains that are beautiful but not much good for farming. The only reason Blackwater Falls exists is that silver mine. And when it's gone—" "Yes, I see." Bella turned back from the window. "Mrs. McKenna, might I ask about the town's leadership? The mayor seems optimistic. Tom Brennan means well, but he's better at talking than doing. The real power in this town has always been the mine owners and the ranchers, men with money and influence. And who might they be?" Sarah hesitated, clearly wondering why a visitor would be so interested in local politics. "Well, there's James Garrett, like I mentioned. He runs the mine for the consortium back east. Then there's Samuel Crawford. He owns the largest ranch in the valley, runs cattle and horses. And Judge William Morrison handles all the legal affairs, property disputes, that sort of thing." At the mention of Crawford and Morrison, Bella's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained casual when she spoke. "Interesting. These men have been prominent in the community for some time?" "Oh yes, the Crawford and Morrison families have been here since the town was founded. Samuel's father started the ranch, and the judge's family has always been involved in territorial politics. They're good men, pillars of the community." Bella smiled, but this time there was something sharp in the expression, like sunlight glinting off a blade. "I'm sure they are. Well, Mrs. McKenna, I should let you get back to your work. Thank you for the information." After Sarah left, Bella sat on the narrow bed and opened her traveling case. Beneath carefully folded dresses and undergarments lay a leather portfolio tied with ribbon. She untied it with steady hands and spread the contents across the quilt. Documents, photographs, maps and letters that represented 10 years of careful planning and preparation. At the top of the pile was a daguerreotype of a young girl, perhaps 16 years old, with long dark hair and frightened eyes. The girl wore a simple dress and stood beside a modest wooden house, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. On the back of the photograph in faded ink, someone had written, "Isabella Rodriguez, age 16, Blackwater Falls, 1863. Bella picked up the photograph and studied it for a long moment. The scared girl in the image seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. That girl had believed in justice, had trusted that truth would protect her from false accusations and mob justice. That girl had learned the hard way that power was more important than truth, that money could buy silence and respectability, and that a pregnant 16-year-old with no family had no value in a community that prized order above justice. But that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who understood how the world really worked. A woman who had spent 10 years building wealth and influence, preparing for this moment of return. A woman who knew that sometimes justice had to be bought and paid for, just like everything else. Bella set the photograph aside and picked up a land survey map of the Blackwater Falls area. Red marks indicated mineral rights, water rights, and property boundaries. Blue marks showed railroad survey routes that had been planned but never built. Green marks indicated something else entirely, deposits that the current mine owners had never discovered, resources that could transform the region's economy if properly developed. The irony was almost too perfect. The town that had cast her out for shame was dying, and she was the only one with the knowledge and resources to save it. The men who had destroyed her life were now dependent on the very forces she controlled, though they didn't know it yet. There was a knock at her door. Bella quickly gathered the documents and returned them to the portfolio, which she slid under the bed before opening the door. A young woman stood in the hallway, perhaps 20 years old, with auburn hair and curious brown eyes. She wore a simple but well-made dress and carried herself with quiet confidence. "Miss Vasquez, I'm Emily McKenna, Sarah's daughter. Mother asked me to see if you needed anything else for your room." Bella studied the young woman with interest. "Emily, that's a lovely name. Have you lived in Blackwater Falls all your life?" "Yes, ma'am. Born and raised here, though I sometimes wonder what it would be like to live somewhere with more opportunities." "And what sort of opportunities interest you?" Emily's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I'd love to teach. Maybe start a proper school. We have a one-room schoolhouse now, but the teacher left last month when her husband got work in Denver. The children are falling behind, and some of the parents are talking about sending them away to boarding schools if they can afford it." "Education is certainly important," Bella agreed. "Tell me, Emily, what do you know about the history of Blackwater Falls, the early days of the settlement?" "Oh, quite a bit. I love hearing the old stories. My mother and father were among the settlers back in 1858 when they discovered silver in the mountains. Those were exciting times from what I hear. People coming from all over, building the town from nothing, everyone believing they were going to strike it rich." "And did they strike it rich?" Emily's expression grew more somber. "Some did for a while, but as Mother always says, boom times don't last forever. People made mistakes, trusted the wrong folks, got caught up in scandals that tore the community apart." "What kind of scandals?" Emily glanced around the hallway, as if worried about being overheard. "Well, there was that terrible business about 10 years ago. A young girl accused some prominent men of improper behavior. The whole thing created quite a stir, split the town right down the middle." Bella's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice carefully neutral. "What happened to the girl?" "She left town, or was driven out, depending on who tells the story. Some people believed her accusations, others thought she was lying to cover up her own condition. It was all very tragic, really. The girl was so young, and she had no family to protect her, and the men she accused, they stayed, of course. They were important people, respected members of the community. Life went on." Emily paused, studying Bella's face. "You seem very interested in our local history, Miss Vasquez. I find frontier communities fascinating," Bella replied smoothly. "The way they handle conflict, establish justice, determine who belongs and who doesn't. It says a great deal about human nature. Emily nodded thoughtfully. I suppose it does. Well, if you need anything else, just let Mother or me know. We're always happy to help visitors feel welcome. After Emily left, Bella returned to her documents. She pulled out a letter dated 6 months earlier, written on expensive letterhead from a San Francisco law firm. Dear Miss Vasquez, as per your instructions, we have completed the purchase of mineral rights to sections 12 through 18 of the Blackwater Valley Survey. The transactions were conducted through shell companies as you requested, ensuring that your identity remains confidential. The geological surveys you commissioned have confirmed substantial copper and gold deposits in the areas specified, far exceeding the silver reserves currently being extracted. Additionally, we have secured options on the railroad spur line that would connect Blackwater Falls to the main Denver and Rio Grande route. The territorial government has approved the construction pending adequate financial backing, which your consortium is prepared to provide. In summary, you now control the future economic development of the entire Blackwater Valley region. The current mine owners and town leadership remain unaware of these developments. Please advise when you wish to proceed with the revelation of these holdings. Respectfully yours, Harrison and Associates. Bella folded the letter carefully and returned it to the portfolio. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of revealing her hand, piece by piece, until the truth could no longer be denied or ignored. The men who had destroyed her life were about to discover that the powerless 16-year-old they'd crushed had become something far more dangerous than they could imagine. But first, she needed to understand how much the town had changed, who could be trusted, and who still posed a threat. The scared girl who had fled Blackwater Falls 10 years ago had learned to plan carefully, to anticipate every possible move her enemies might make. The woman who had returned was about to teach them the true meaning of justice, frontier style. As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the struggling town, Bella stood at her window and watched the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Tomorrow she would start the process of either saving Blackwater Falls or watching it burn to the ground. Either way, justice would finally be served. The morning sun was barely cresting the mountain peaks when Bella descended the narrow staircase to the McKenna's dining room. The aroma of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, mixing with the scent of biscuits baking in the kitchen's wood-fired oven. Sarah McKenna moved efficiently between the kitchen and dining room, her movements practiced from years of feeding travelers and boarders who passed through Blackwater Falls during better times. "Good morning, Miss Vasquez," Sarah called out, wiping her hands on her apron. "I trust you slept well. The mountain air takes some getting used to for folks coming from the city." "Very well, thank you," Bella replied, taking a seat at the long wooden table that dominated the dining room. The furniture was solid but simple, built to last through the harsh winters and constant use that characterized frontier establishments. "The coffee smells wonderful." Sarah poured steaming coffee into a heavy ceramic mug and set it before Bella, along with a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits. "Emily's already gone out to tend the chickens and check on our vegetable garden. That girl's up before dawn every day, always finding something useful to do." Bella sipped her coffee, noting its rich flavor. A luxury in a town where most supplies had to be hauled in by wagon train. She seems like a remarkable young woman, very intelligent and well-spoken for someone who's never left Blackwater Falls. Oh, Emily's always had big dreams, reads everything she can get her hands on, orders books from back east with her own money. Sometimes I worry those dreams will take her away from us. But then I remember what happened to the last girl who had big dreams in this town. Sarah's voice grew quiet, and she glanced around as if making sure they wouldn't be overheard. "The girl you mentioned yesterday, the one involved in the scandal?" Sarah nodded, settling into the chair across from Bella with her own cup of coffee. Isabella Rodriguez, beautiful girl, smart as a whip, but she came from nothing. Her parents died in a mining accident when she was 14, left her to fend for herself. Some of the church ladies took her in, made sure she had food and shelter, but she was always different, independent, spoke her mind when maybe she should have kept quiet. Bella's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee mug. Different how? Well, she wasn't content to just accept her place, if you know what I mean. Most girls in her situation would have been grateful for any attention from respectable men, any chance to improve their circumstances through marriage. But Isabella had ideas about making her own way, maybe even leaving Blackwater Falls to seek her fortune elsewhere. And that made people uncomfortable? Sarah stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Some folks, yes. There's a natural order to things. In communities like ours, Miss Vasquez, everyone has their place, their role to play. When someone tries to rise above their station too quickly, it can cause problems. What kind of problems? The kind that end with a 16-year-old girl being run out of town in the middle of the night, Sarah said quietly. Whether she deserved it or not is still a matter of debate around here. Before Bella could respond, the dining room door opened, and Mayor Brennan entered, his face flushed from the morning walk and his eyes bright with anticipation. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His hair was freshly combed, his clothes brushed clean, and his boots polished to a shine that reflected the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Miss Vasquez. Excellent. I hoped I might catch you at breakfast. I've arranged a tour of our fair community this morning, if you're amenable. I thought we might start with the mine operations, then visit some of our local businesses, and perhaps conclude with a ride out to the Crawford Ranch. Samuel's quite eager to meet you. Bella smiled politely, though Sarah noticed a subtle shift in the woman's posture at the mention of Crawford's name. That sounds very thorough, Mayor Brennan. I appreciate your attention to my interests. Think nothing of it, my dear lady. Any potential investor deserves our full attention and cooperation. Brennan helped himself to coffee from the pot Sarah had left on the sideboard. I took the liberty of arranging for horses from the livery stable. I trust you ride? I do indeed, Bella replied, and there was something in her tone that suggested her equestrian skills might surprise the good mare. An hour later, Bella emerged from the boarding house wearing a riding habit that was both practical and elegant. The deep blue fabric was cut in the latest style, but designed for actual riding rather than mere appearance. Her boots were quality leather, well broken in, and her gloves showed the subtle wear patterns of someone who regularly handled reins and saddle leather. Mayor Brennan waited beside two horses, a gentle mare for Bella and a sturdy gelding for himself. But when Bella approached the animals, she ignored the mare and walked directly to the gelding, running her hands expertly along his neck and checking his legs with the practiced eye of someone who knew horseflesh. "This one will do nicely," she said, swinging into the saddle with fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle. "Shall we proceed?" Brennan blinked in surprise, but quickly mounted the mare, which suddenly seemed rather small beneath his considerable bulk. "Certainly, certainly. Our first stop is the Silver Crown Mine, about 2 miles up the canyon. It's the heart of our community's prosperity." They rode through the main street of Blackwater Falls, and Bella took careful note of the changes that had occurred during her 10-year absence. Several buildings stood empty, their windows boarded up and their signs faded by sun and weather. The population had clearly declined. Where once the street would have been bustling with activity at this hour, now only a few people moved about, their morning business. But Bella also noticed signs of stubborn resilience. The buildings that remained occupied were well maintained, their owners clearly determined to weather the economic downturn. Children played in doorways and yards, their laughter bright against the backdrop of economic uncertainty. Gardens and Small livestock pens showed that residents were adapting, finding ways to supplement their income and feed their families despite the town's declining fortunes. "As you can see," Brennan said, gesturing toward the empty buildings, "we've experienced some temporary setbacks in recent years, but the fundamental character of our community remains strong. We're survivors here, Miss Vasquez. We don't give up easily." "I can see that," Bella replied, her eyes tracking the movement of people going about their daily routines. "Tell me, Mayor, what specific challenges has the community faced, beyond the obvious mining difficulties?" Brennan's expression grew more serious. "Well, there's been some political tensions, disagreements about how to respond to the economic pressures. Some folks want to abandon the town entirely, move to places with more opportunity. Others believe we should diversify our economy, perhaps try to attract railroad development or establish other industries." "And what's your position?" "I believe in Blackwater Falls," Brennan said firmly. "This community has weathered difficult times before. We just need new investment, new ideas, new energy. That's why your visit is so encouraging, Miss Vasquez. Fresh capital and outside perspective could make all the difference." They rode up the winding canyon road toward the mine, passing through stands of aspen and pine that painted the mountainsides in brilliant gold and green. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the mining camp and the distant sound of machinery echoing off the canyon walls. The Silver Crown mine was an impressive operation, even in its current reduced state. Wooden structures climbed the mountainside like giant steps, connected by narrow-gauge railroad tracks that carried ore cars down to the processing facility in the valley below. Steam rose from various buildings where crushers and separators worked to extract silver from the raw ore, and the constant hammering of machinery created a rhythmic percussion that had been the heartbeat of Blackwater Falls for 15 years. James. Garrett emerged from the mine office as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting against the morning sun. He was a man in his 40s, with the lean build and weathered skin of someone who'd spent his career in mining camps across the West. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, and his manner direct in the way of men who dealt with dangerous work and couldn't afford to waste time on social niceties. "Mayor," Garrett nodded briefly to Brennan before turning his attention to Bella. "And you must be our visitor from San Francisco, James Garrett, mine superintendent." "Isabella Vasquez," Bella replied, dismounting with the same fluid grace she'd shown earlier. "I'm interested in learning about your operation here, Mr. Garrett." Garrett's eyes assessed her with the calculating look of a man trying to determine whether he was dealing with a serious potential investor or merely a curious tourist. "Well, Miss Vasquez, I'll give you the honest truth, not the pretty speech. The mayor might prefer. This mine is in trouble." Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, James, I don't think we need to—" "She asked for information, Tom, and she deserves the facts." Garrett's tone brooked no argument. "Miss Vasquez, the Silver Crown has been operating for 15 years. We've pulled out over $2 million worth of silver in that time, but the easy pickings are long gone. We're having to dig deeper, shore up more tunnel walls, pump out more water. Costs are rising while yields are falling." "How much longer can the operation continue?" Bella asked. "At current production levels. Maybe 6 months, possibly a year if we're lucky and find a new vein." "But realistically," Garrett shrugged, "we're looking at closure within the year unless something changes dramatically." "And what would it take to extend the mine's life significantly?" Garrett studied her more intently. "New capital for deeper excavation, modern equipment for processing, lower-grade ore, and ideally expansion into surrounding areas where we haven't had survey rights." He paused. "But that would require substantial investment, more than the current owners are willing or able to provide." Bella nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And these surrounding areas you mentioned, who controls the mineral rights? That's the frustrating part, Garrett said, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. Several key parcels have been bought up by outside interests over the past year, companies nobody around here has ever heard of, paying top dollar for land that most folks thought was worthless. Interesting, Bella murmured. And these companies haven't indicated any plans for development. Nothing. They just bought the land and disappeared. It's like they're waiting for something, but nobody knows what. Brennan had been growing increasingly uncomfortable during this exchange. Perhaps we should continue our tour, Miss Vasquez. I'd like to show you some of our other local enterprises. Of course, Bella agreed, but her eyes remained on Garrett. Mr. Garrett, I appreciate your honesty. It's refreshing to deal with someone who speaks plainly about business realities. In my experience, Miss Vasquez, pretty lies don't pay wages or put food on tables. If you're thinking about investing in this operation, you deserve to know what you'd be getting into. As they rode away from the mine, Brennan seemed eager to change the subject. James has always been rather pessimistic, but his concerns may be overstated. There are other opportunities in our valley, other sources of potential prosperity, such as ranching for one. Samuel Crawford runs one of the finest cattle operations in the territory, and there's always the possibility of railroad development. We're not that far from the main lines, and with the right investment. Their next stop was the Crawford Ranch, a sprawling operation that covered several thousand acres of prime grazing land in the valley below town. The ranch buildings were substantial and well-maintained, speaking of both prosperity and pride, of ownership. Cattle dotted the rolling hills like black and brown specks against the golden grass, and several cowboys worked horses in a large corral near the main barn. Samuel Crawford emerged from the ranch house as they approached, and Bella felt her breath catch involuntarily. He'd aged, of course. 10 years had added lines around his eyes and grey to his temples, but he was still the same imposing figure who had dominated her nightmares for years. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that made people automatically defer to his authority, Crawford possessed the easy confidence of a man who'd never been successfully challenged. "Tom, right on time!" Crawford called out, striding toward them with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "And this must be our distinguished visitor." "Samuel Crawford," he said, extending his hand to help Bella dismount. "Welcome to the Double C Ranch, Miss Vasquez." Bella allowed him to assist her, though every instinct screamed against accepting help from this man. His touch, even through her gloves, sent a shiver of revulsion through her body. But she maintained her composed exterior. "Mr. Crawford, I've heard a great deal about your operation here." "All good, I hope," Crawford replied with the easy charm that had always been his most dangerous weapon. "Would you like a tour of the facilities? I think you'll find we run one of the most efficient ranching operations in the territory." For the next hour, Crawford led them through his domain with obvious pride. The ranch was indeed impressive. Modern facilities, healthy livestock, well-trained employees who clearly respected their employer. Crawford spoke knowledgeably about breeding programs, market conditions, and expansion plans, presenting himself as a forward-thinking businessman adapting to changing times. But Bella noticed other things as well. The way Crawford's employees watched him with wariness beneath their apparent respect. The subtle signs of tight financial management that suggested the ranch's prosperity might not be as solid as appearances suggested. And most importantly, the way Crawford's eyes lingered on her with a calculating intensity that hadn't changed in 10 years. "I'm curious about your labor situation," Bella said, as they stood watching cowboys work cattle in one of the corrals. "I understand many communities in the region are experiencing population decline." "We've been fortunate," Crawford replied. "Good employees tend to stay when they're treated fairly and paid regularly. Of course, we've had to make some adjustments over the years, become more selective about who we hire. There was something in his tone that made Bella look at him more sharply. Selective how? Oh, just the usual considerations. Character, reliability, family background. In a small community like ours, reputation matters. We can't afford to associate with people who might bring scandal or trouble to the operation. The words hung in the air between them, and Bella realized with cold certainty that Crawford knew exactly who she was. He was testing her, probing to see how she would react to his veiled references to the past. I imagine scandal can be quite destructive in close-knit communities, Bella said carefully, though I've always believed that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of how deeply it's buried. Crawford's smile didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Indeed, though sometimes the truth can be complicated, what seems clear at first glance often proves more complex upon closer examination. And sometimes, Bella replied, meeting his gaze directly, what appears complex is actually quite simple. It just takes the right perspective to see clearly. Mayor Brennan, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, chose that moment to suggest they visit the final stop on their tour, Judge Morrison's office in town. As they prepared to leave the ranch, Crawford caught Bella's arm lightly. Miss Vasquez, I do hope we'll have the opportunity to speak again during your stay. I have a feeling we have much to discuss about mutual interests. I'm certain we do, Mr. Crawford, Bella replied. I'm certain we do. The ride back to town was quiet, each rider lost in their own thoughts. Brennan seemed pleased with the tour, convinced that he'd showcased the community's potential effectively, but Bella's mind was racing, processing everything she'd observed and planning her next moves. Crawford knew who she was. That much was certain, which meant her carefully planned revelation would need to be accelerated. The advantage of surprise was lost, but perhaps that was for the better. A direct confrontation would be more satisfying than elaborate misdirection. As they approached the town limits, Bella made a decision that would change everything. Mayor Brennan, she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority. I believe it's time we visited Judge Morrison. I have some legal matters to discuss that can't wait. Certainly, Miss Vasquez, though I should mention that the judge is quite busy this afternoon. Perhaps we could schedule an appointment for— No, Bella interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. This afternoon, these matters have already waited far too long. As they rode down Main Street toward the courthouse, Bella felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that had sustained her through 10 years of preparation. The scared 16-year-old girl was still there, buried deep inside her. But she was no longer in control. The woman who would soon face Judge Morrison had learned to fight with weapons far more powerful than tears and pleas for justice. She had money, influence, and most importantly, she had patience. The wait was almost over. The Blackwater Falls Courthouse stood at the end of Main Street like a monument to frontier justice, its weathered stone facade bearing the scars of 15 years of mountain winters and blazing summers. Judge William Morrison had insisted on stone construction when the building was erected, declaring that the law should be housed in something permanent, something that would outlast the boom and bust, cycles that claimed so many frontier communities. Now, as Bella dismounted in front of the courthouse, she wondered if the judge had any idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The interior of the courthouse was dim and cool, with high windows that cast long rectangles of sunlight across. The polished wooden floors. The walls were lined with law books, territorial statutes, and framed documents that spoke of civilization imposed upon wilderness through legal precedent and judicial authority. Behind the imposing wooden desk that dominated the courtroom sat Judge William Morrison, reviewing documents with the methodical precision that had made him both respected and feared throughout the territory. Morrison was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through pretense and evasion with uncomfortable clarity. He wore the black robes of his office even when court was not in session, understanding that symbols of authority mattered in a place where law was often the only thing standing between order and chaos. When he looked up from his papers to see Mayor Brennan entering with their distinguished visitor, his expression showed polite interest, mixed with the wariness of a man who'd learned to be suspicious of unexpected interruptions. "Your Honor," Brennan began, removing his hat and speaking in the deferential tone he reserved for the community's most powerful figures. "I'd like to present Miss Isabella Vasquez, our visitor from San Francisco. Miss Vasquez has expressed interest in discussing some legal matters with you." Morrison rose from behind his desk, his movements deliberate and dignified. "Miss Vasquez, I understand you represent certain business interests that may have dealings in our territory. How may I assist?" "You?" Bella stepped forward, her bearing confident but respectful in the way of someone who understood courtroom dynamics. "Judge Morrison, I appreciate you taking the time to see me without prior appointment. The matters I need to discuss are both urgent and confidential." Morrison gestured toward the chairs arranged before his bench. "Please be seated. Mayor Brennan, I believe Miss Vasquez mentioned these were confidential matters." Brennan's face showed disappointment, but he nodded reluctantly. "Of course, Your Honor. Miss Vasquez, I'll wait outside. Perhaps we can continue our tour afterward." "That won't be necessary, Mayor," Bella replied, her tone polite but final. "I believe my business in Blackwater Falls will be concluded quite soon." After Brennan left, Morrison returned to his seat and studied Bella with the intense focus he brought to all legal proceedings. "Now then, Miss Vasquez, what confidential matters bring you to my court?" Bella opened her leather portfolio and withdrew a thick sheaf of documents, laying them carefully on Morrison's desk. "Judge Morrison, before we begin, I must ask whether you remember a case that came before this court 10 years ago, the matter of Isabella Rodriguez versus the territory of Colorado." Morrison's expression didn't change, but Bella caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated recognition. "That name is familiar. A criminal case, if I recall correctly. Charges related to public morality and disturbing the peace." "Among other things," Bella said quietly. "Do you remember the defendant, Judge Morrison?" "Vaguely. A young woman making wild accusations against prominent members of the community. The case was resolved when she left the territory voluntarily, avoiding prosecution." Morrison's tone was carefully neutral, but his hands had stilled on his desk. Bella smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Morrison instinctively lean back in his chair. "Judge Morrison, I'm Isabella Rodriguez, and I have not returned to Blackwater Falls voluntarily." The silence that followed was absolute. Morrison stared at her with the expression of a man watching his carefully ordered world begin to crumble. His face cycled through recognition, shock, and something that might have been fear before settling into the rigid mask he wore when delivering difficult verdicts. "Miss Rodriguez," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "this is unexpected. I understood you had relocated permanently to avoid the legal difficulties surrounding your previous residence here." "I was driven out by a conspiracy of lies, Judge Morrison, lies that you helped legitimize from this very bench." Bella's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. "I was 16 years old, pregnant, and completely alone. I came to you seeking justice, and instead, you became part of the machine that destroyed my life." Morrison stood abruptly, his robes rustling with the sudden movement. "Miss Rodriguez, I would caution you about making accusations you cannot substantiate. The case 10 years ago was adjudicated according to territorial law and established legal precedent, was it?" Bella opened her portfolio and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This belonged to Dr. Marcus Webb. You remember Dr. Webb, don't you? The town physician who examined me after the incident. Morrison's face had gone pale. I fail to see the relevance of... Dr. Webb kept detailed medical records, Judge Morrison. Records that documented the physical evidence of assault. Evidence that was never presented during the proceedings because certain prominent citizens convinced him it would be better for everyone if those records disappeared. Bella opened the journal and began reading in a clear, carrying voice. Patient Isabella Rodriguez, age 16. Physical examination reveals evidence consistent with forcible assault. Bruising patterns on upper arms, defensive wounds on hands, internal trauma consistent with rape by adult male. Those records are not admissible in any current proceeding, Morrison said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps not in your court, Judge Morrison, but they're quite compelling when presented to territorial investigators, federal marshals, and newspaper reporters. Bella closed the journal and looked directly at Morrison. Dr. Webb's conscience troubled him for 10 years, before his death. Last month he entrusted these records to an attorney in Denver with instructions to deliver them to me. Morrison sank back into his chair, the weight of his robes suddenly seeming to drag him down. What do you want? What I wanted 10 years. Ego, justice, truth, and acknowledgement of what was done to an innocent girl by men who were supposed to protect her. Bella stood and walked to the tall windows that overlooked Main Street. I've spent 10 years building the resources necessary to ensure that justice is finally served. Miss Rodriguez, you must understand the position I was in. Samuel Crawford and his associates were pillars of the community. Their word carried enormous weight, while I was nobody, the orphan daughter of dead miners, with no family to protect me and no money to hire legal representation. Bella turned back to face him. I understand perfectly, Judge Morrison. I understand that justice is for sale, just like everything else. Morrison leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. If money is what you're after, Miss Rodriguez, I'm sure arrangements could be made. Samuel Crawford is a wealthy man, and he values his reputation highly. Perhaps some form of financial settlement. You think this is about money? Bella's laugh was cold as winter wind off the mountains. Judge Morrison, I currently control mineral rights to over 10,000 acres in this valley. I own options on railroad development that could transform this region. I have enough money to buy and sell Samuel Crawford's ranch 3 times over. Morrison stared at her in confusion. Then what? I want you to call a town meeting, Judge Morrison. Tonight. I want every adult resident of Blackwater Falls to gather in this courthouse, and I want you to tell them the truth about what happened 10 years ago. That's impossible. The social fabric of this community is built on lies and corruption, Bella finished, and it's about to be torn apart whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you'll have any credibility left when the dust settles. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents spread across his desk as if they contained answers to questions he didn't want to ask. Miss Rodriguez, let us assume for the sake of argument that certain irregularities occurred. During your previous legal difficulties, what would you consider adequate resolution after all these years? I told you, a public admission of the truth. A formal apology from every man who participated in the conspiracy against me, and assurance that nothing like this will ever happen to another young woman in Blackwater Falls, and if these demands are met. Bella walked back to Morrison's desk and gathered her documents. Then I might be willing to discuss the railroad development project that could save this town from becoming another ghost story. The project that requires cooperation between my investors and local authorities to succeed. The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. You're saying the economic future of Blackwater Falls depends on justice finally being served. Yes, Judge Morrison, that's exactly what I'm saying. Bella closed her portfolio and turned toward the door. You have until 6 o'clock this evening to decide whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. As Bella reached the courthouse door, Morrison called after her. Miss Rodriguez, what guarantee do I have that meeting your demands will actually result in this railroad development? Bella paused without turning around. The same guarantee you gave me 10 years ago when I came seeking justice? None. The courthouse steps were crowded with townspeople who had gathered after word spread about the mysterious confrontation inside. Bella emerged to find at least 50 residents waiting in the late afternoon sun, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity, concern, and growing excitement as rumors circulated about her true identity and purpose. Emily McKenna pushed through. The crowd, her young face bright with intelligence and barely contained energy. Miss Vasquez, or should I say Miss Rodriguez, is it true? Are you really the girl from the stories? It's true, Bella said simply, and a murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Then the stories about what really happened, Emily began, were true as well, Bella confirmed. Every word. Old Pete Johansson stepped forward, his massive frame parting the crowd like a ship through water. His weathered face showed a mixture of shame and determination as he removed his hat and faced Bella directly. Miss Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. We all do. I believed what I was told to believe, trusted men I thought were honorable, and helped drive an innocent girl from her home. His voice carried clearly across the square, and several other townspeople nodded in agreement. If there's anything I can do to make amends... There is, Bella replied. Be at the courthouse tonight at 7 o'clock. Bring everyone you know. It's time for the whole truth to come out. Dr. Webb pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched in one hand and his hat in the other. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he approached Bella. Miss Rodriguez, I heard about the medical records, about Dr. Marcus Webb's journal. I want you to know that I've always suspected, that is, there were always questions. He struggled to find the words. If you need a current medical examination to corroborate the historical evidence, I would be honored to provide professional testimony. Thank you, Dr. Webb. Your offer means more than you know. Bella's voice softened with genuine emotion. It's comforting to know that there are still people in Blackwater Falls who value truth over convenience. The crowd began to disperse as people hurried home to share the news and prepare for the evening's revelations. But Sarah McKenna remained, her face showing a mixture of maternal concern and fierce protectiveness. Isabella, she said, using the familiar name from Bella's childhood. Are you sure about this path you're taking? There are powerful men in this town who won't go down without a fight. I'm sure, Mrs. McKenna. I've been sure for 10 years. Bella smiled at the woman who had always been kind to her. But I appreciate your concern, and I want you to know that everything I'm doing is designed to help Blackwater Falls, not destroy it. And Samuel Crawford? What about him? Bella's expression hardened. Samuel Crawford will face the consequences of his actions, all of them. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the town square, Bella made her way back to the boarding house. She had 3 hours before the town meeting, 3 hours to prepare for the confrontation that would either vindicate her suffering or complete her destruction. In her room, she spread out the documents that represented 10 years of careful planning and resource accumulation, letters from railroad executives, geological surveys showing massive mineral deposits, contracts for equipment and materials that could transform Blackwater Falls into a thriving transportation hub. Everything was ready, contingent only on tonight's revelations and the community's response to the truth. But beyond the business documents lay more personal items, the original medical records that proved her innocence, sworn statements from Witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak, and most importantly, letters from other women who had suffered similar fates in communities across the frontier. Isabella Rodriguez had not been Samuel Crawford's only victim, merely his most inconvenient one. As 7 o'clock approached, Bella dressed carefully in a black dress that spoke of both mourning and determination. She pinned her hair severely back and chose jewelry that was elegant but not ostentatious. She wanted to be seen as successful, but not threatening, powerful, but not predatory. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity when she arrived. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls and spilled out into the evening air. Judge Morrison sat behind his bench, looking like a man facing his own execution, while Mayor Brennan wrung his hands nervously in the front row. Samuel Crawford sat in the center of the courtroom, surrounded by his ranch hands and business associates. His face showed defiant confidence, as if he still believed his money and influence could control the outcome of the evening's proceedings. But Bella also saw encouraging signs. Dr. Webb sat in the front row, with his medical bag open, prepared to provide expert testimony. Emily McKenna had positioned herself near the court reporter's desk, ready to ensure accurate documentation of the proceedings. And old Pete Johansson stood near the back door, his massive presence serving as both security and moral support. Judge Morrison called for order and introduced Bella as Isabella Rodriguez, formerly of Blackwater Falls. The crowd fell silent as she walked to the witness stand, her heels clicking against the wooden floor with the same measured precision she'd shown upon her arrival. 10 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed courtroom, I was a 16-year-old orphan who believed that truth and justice were the same thing. Tonight, I'm here to tell you what really happened and to give this community one last chance to choose between lies and truth. She paused, looking out over the faces of people who had known her as a child, who had watched her grow up, and who had ultimately chosen to believe the worst about her rather than challenge the word of powerful men. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but every word is true, and I have evidence to prove it. And with that, Isabella Rodriguez began to tell the story that would either save Blackwater Falls or watch it burn to the ground. The reckoning had finally begun. The packed courthouse held its collective breath as Isabella Rodriguez stood at the witness stand, her black dress stark against the warm wood paneling, her green eyes scanning the faces of people who had once been her neighbors, her community, her world. The silence was so complete that the ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo like gunshots. In the mountain air, Judge Morrison sat rigid behind his bench, his knuckles white as he gripped his gavel, while Samuel Crawford lounged in his seat with studied casualness that fooled no one who looked closely enough to see the tension in his jaw. I was 14 when my parents died in the mine collapse of 1861, Bella began, her voice steady and clear, the same collapse that killed 12 other miners and left their families destitute. Samuel Crawford was on the mine safety board then, and his ranch supplied the timber used for tunnel supports, timber that the subsequent investigation proved was substandard, rotted, completely inadequate for the job it was meant to do. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several people glanced at Crawford, whose expression had shifted from casual confidence to watchful wariness. The investigation was quietly dropped when Mr. Crawford made generous donations to the families of the deceased and pledged to improve safety standards. No criminal charges were filed. No one was held accountable. Bella's voice carried no emotion, but her words hit the courtroom like physical blows. My parents died because Samuel Crawford chose profit over human lives, and then bought his way out of the consequences. Crawford half rose from his seat. Your Honor, these are slanderous accusations with no basis in... Yes, Crawford said simply. I raped her. I threatened her. I conspired with others to cover up my crime and destroy her reputation. Everything she said is true." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Some people shouted in anger, others wept openly, and several of Crawford's ranch hands headed for the exits in disgust. Judge Morrison pounded his gavel repeatedly, but the crowd was beyond his control now. Dr. Webb stood up again, his voice cutting through the noise. "I want everyone here to know that I examined Isabella the morning after the assault. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I have photographs, detailed medical reports, and physical evidence that I've preserved for 10 years, waiting for this moment." "Then why didn't you speak up?" someone shouted from the back of the courtroom. Dr. Webb's face crumpled with shame. "Because I was a coward. Because Samuel Crawford threatened to destroy my medical practice if I testified against him. Because Judge Morrison assured me that justice would be served quietly, without the need for public scandal." He looked directly at Bella. "Isabella, I failed you when you needed me most. I let fear and self-interest override my oath as a physician and my duty as a human being." Judge Morrison stood slowly, his robe seeming to weigh him down like chains. "The court recognizes that a grave injustice was committed 10 years ago. An injustice that this court helped perpetrate through cowardice and corruption." His voice cracked with emotion. "Miss Rodriguez, I offer my formal apology and my resignation from the territorial bench, effective immediately." Bella looked out, over the chaotic courtroom, seeing faces filled with shock, anger, shame, and dawning hope. The truth was finally out, the lies finally exposed. But this was only the beginning of what needed to happen. "The question now," she said, her voice somehow carrying over the noise and confusion, "is what this community chooses to do with the truth. Whether you decide to build something better on the ashes of the old lies, or whether you allow yourselves to be destroyed by the weight of your own guilt." She gathered her documents and stepped down from the witness stand. "I'll be at the hotel until tomorrow evening. Anyone who wants to discuss the future of Blackwater Falls, the real future, built on truth and justice, knows where to find me." As Bella walked toward the courthouse doors, the crowd parted before her like water. Some people reached out to touch her arm or whisper apologies, while others simply stared in stunned silence. At the door, she paused and looked back at the courtroom that had once been the scene of her greatest defeat. Now it had become the stage for her ultimate vindication. But more importantly, it had become the place where Blackwater Falls could choose between death and redemption. The choice, as always, was theirs to make. Dawn broke grey and cold over Blackwater Falls the morning after the courthouse revelation, and the town felt like a community in mourning. Word of the previous night's confessions had spread to every household, every business, every corner of the valley by sunrise. People moved through their morning routines with the mechanical motions of shock, speaking in hushed tones when they spoke at all. The comfortable certainties that had governed their lives for 10 years had been shattered in a single evening, leaving them to navigate a world where everything they thought they knew had proven to be built on lies. Bella stood at her hotel window, watching the subdued activity on Main Street, noting how people avoided eye contact with each other, how conversations died when strangers approached, how the very air seemed heavy with unspoken guilt and confusion. She'd slept little during the night, her mind racing through the implications of what had been revealed and the massive decisions that lay ahead. The scared 16-year-old girl was finally vindicated, but the successful businesswoman had work to do that would determine the fate of hundreds of lives. A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. She opened it to find Emily McKenna, standing in the hallway, her young face marked by tears and exhaustion, but her eyes burning with determined purpose. "Miss Rodriguez, I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I had to speak with you before..." Emily's voice trailed off as she struggled to find the right words. "Before I decide whether to save your town or let it die," Bella finished quietly. "Come in, Emily. I think we need to talk." Emily entered the room and sat heavily in the single chair, her usual energy replaced by the weight of everything she'd learned the night before. "I can't stop thinking about what they did to you. How young you were, how alone, how everyone just believed the lies because it was easier than confronting the truth about men they respected." Bella poured coffee from the pot Sarah McKenna had brought up earlier and handed a cup to Emily. "What disturbs you most? The original crimes or the fact that an entire community chose to be complicit in covering them up?" "Both," Emily said without hesitation. "But mostly I keep thinking about all the times over the years when people told stories about the Rodriguez girl and what she supposedly did, making her into a cautionary tale about loose morals and fallen women, when all along she was the victim of the very men they were protecting. And now that you know the truth," Emily's jaw set with determination that reminded Bella of herself at that age. "Now I want to make sure nothing like this ever happens again in Blackwater Falls. I want to create a community where young women are protected, where truth matters more than reputation, where justice isn't for sale to the highest bidder." Bella studied the young woman carefully. "That's a noble goal, Emily. But it requires more than good intentions. It requires people willing to stand up to power, to sacrifice their own comfort for principles they claim to believe in." "Does Blackwater Falls have enough people like that to make such a transformation possible?" "I don't know," Emily admitted, "but I think last night changed something fundamental. People saw what happens when good people stay silent in the face of evil. Maybe that's enough to make them choose differently next time." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. This time it was Dr. Webb, his medical bag in one hand and his hat in the other, his face haggard from a sleepless night of soul-searching. "Miss Rodriguez, I wonder if I might have a word. I know I have no right to ask for your time after my cowardice 10 years ago, but there are things that need to be said." Bella gestured for him to enter. "Dr. Webb, please sit down. Emily and I were just discussing the possibility of change in Blackwater Falls." Dr. Webb perched nervously on the edge of the bed, his hands working at the brim of his hat. "Miss Rodriguez, I've spent the night reviewing not just your case, but other incidents over the years where I suspected abuse but remained silent. Cases where I could have spoken up, could have made a difference, but chose professional preservation over moral courage." "How many other cases?" Bella asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer would be disturbing. 7 women in 10 years. Different circumstances, different perpetrators, but all involving powerful men taking advantage of vulnerable women. And in every case, I documented the evidence and then buried it to avoid conflict with influential families." Dr. Webb's voice broke with self-loathing. "I became complicit in a pattern of abuse that stretches far beyond what happened to you." Emily, who gasped, her coffee cup clattering against its saucer. 7 other women. Dr. Webb, are any of them still in the area? Could they testify to corroborate? 3 moved away permanently. 2 died of various causes, though I sometimes wonder if despair played a role in their decline. 1 married her attacker, in what everyone considered a happy ending, but which I suspect was actually continued victimization. And 1... He paused, looking directly at Bella. 1 is still in Blackwater Falls, living under the weight of shame for something that was never her fault. Bella set down her own cup with deliberate care. "Who?" "Margaret Torres. She's married to the blacksmith now, has 3 children, seems content on the surface. But I see her for medical care sometimes, and there's a sadness in her eyes that never goes away. She was 17 when Samuel Crawford..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The room fell silent as the full scope of Crawford's crimes became clear. This wasn't an isolated incident of powerful men covering up a single mistake. This was a systematic pattern of abuse protected by institutional corruption that had poisoned the entire community. Dr. Webb, Bella said finally, if I were to pursue legal action against everyone involved in this conspiracy, not just Crawford, but Judge Morrison, the town officials who helped cover it up, the business leaders who participated in silencing victims, would you be willing to testify truthfully about all of it? Yes, he said without hesitation. I've lived with this guilt long enough. Whatever consequences I face for my role in these cover-ups, I'll accept them gladly if it means justice is finally served. Emily leaned forward eagerly. And Miss Rodriguez, if we could build legal cases against all the perpetrators, if we could ensure they face real consequences, would that change your decision about the railroad development? Before Bella could answer, rapid footsteps in the hallway announced another visitor. Sarah McKenna appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with excitement and worry. Isabella, there's a crowd gathering outside. Word spread about what you said last night regarding the railroad and mining rights, and half the town wants to talk to you about the future. But there's also trouble brewing. Some of Crawford's associates are claiming the whole thing was a setup to extort money from respectable families. Bella moved to the window and looked down at Main Street. Sure enough, two distinct groups had formed, one centered around old Pete Johansson and several other townspeople who seemed genuinely remorseful about their past complicity, and another around Judge Morrison's cronies and Crawford's business. Associates who appeared to be planning some kind of counterattack. It seems the community is dividing along predictable lines, Bella observed. Those willing to confront the truth versus those determined to maintain the comfortable lies. Sarah wrung her hands nervously. Isabella, I'm worried about your safety. Some of those men are talking about running you out of town again, claiming you're a troublemaker who's trying to destroy the community's reputation for personal gain. Dr. Webb stood up abruptly. Then they'll have to go through me first. I won't stand by and watch another innocent woman be victimized by the same men who've been covering up crimes for years. Emily jumped to her feet as well. And me. I'll stand. With you, Miss Rodriguez. Whatever happens. Bella felt a surge of emotion that caught her by surprise. For 10 years, she'd imagined returning to Blackwater Falls as a lone crusader, seeking justice against a hostile community. She'd never expected to find allies, people willing to risk their own standing to support her cause. Thank you both, she said quietly. But before we face whatever's waiting downstairs, I need to tell you about the choice I've been wrestling with all night. She retrieved her portfolio from the bedside table and spread out maps, contracts, and financial documents that represented millions of dollars in potential development. The railroad consortium I represent is prepared to invest $15 million in connecting Blackwater Falls to the main transportation network. The mining operation I control could employ 500 people and produce wealth that would sustain this community for 50 years. Combined, these projects would transform this dying town into one of the most prosperous communities in the territory. Sarah's eyes widened as she grasped the magnitude of what Bella was describing. $15 million. That's more money than this entire territory has ever seen. But there are conditions, Bella continued. My investors require guarantees that Blackwater Falls is a stable, law-abiding community where contracts will be honored and workers will be protected. They need assurance that the corruption and abuse that characterized the old power structure has been completely eradicated. Dr. Webb nodded slowly. In other words, the economic salvation of Blackwater Falls depends on the community proving it deserves salvation. Exactly. And that proof can only come through actions, not words, through prosecuting the men who committed crimes, even if they're prominent citizens, through electing leaders who value justice over personal relationships, through creating institutions that protect the vulnerable instead of enabling their victimization. Emily's mind was clearly racing as she processed the implications. So the question isn't whether you'll save the town, it's whether the town will save itself by choosing to become something better than it was. That's right, Bella confirmed. I can provide the resources for prosperity, but I can't force a community to be worthy of those resources. That choice belongs to the people of Blackwater Falls. A commotion outside drew their attention back to the window. The two groups in the street had moved closer together, and voices were being raised. As the argument intensified, Judge Morrison stood at the center of one faction, gesturing angrily despite his supposed resignation from the bench. Crawford was notably absent, presumably still dealing with the legal and personal consequences of his public confession, but several of his business associates were clearly attempting to rally support for a counter-narrative that would minimize the impact of the previous night's revelations. "It's starting," Sarah observed, "the battle for the soul of this community." Bella gathered her documents and prepared to face whatever awaited her in the street below. "Then let's go settle this once and for all. The future of Blackwater Falls will be decided in the next few hours, and everyone needs to understand exactly what's at stake." As they prepared to leave the room, Emily caught Bella's arm. "Miss Rodriguez, whatever happens down there, I want you to know that not everyone in Blackwater Falls failed you 10 years ago. There were people who suspected the truth, who wanted to help, but who didn't have the courage to act. Today might be their chance to finally do the right thing." "I hope so, Emily. For all our sakes, I hope so." They descended the stairs together. The vindicated victim, the determined young woman, the guilt-ridden doctor, and the protective innkeeper's wife. Behind them, in the room where Bella had spent the night planning the future of a community that had once cast her out, lay documents that could bring prosperity beyond imagination or consign Blackwater Falls to the dustbin of history. The choice, as it had always been, belonged to the people themselves. But now, for the first time in 10 years, it would be a choice made with full knowledge of the truth. As they reached the bottom of the stairs and prepared to step into the street where two visions of the future were about to clash, Bella felt the last vestiges of the frightened 16-year-old girl finally slip away. In her place stood a woman who had learned that justice delayed was not justice denied. It was justice prepared for the moment when it could be most effective. That moment had finally arrived. The autumn sun hung low over Blackwater Falls as Bella stepped onto Main Street, casting long shadows that seemed to divide the town as clearly as the two groups of residents facing each other in tense confrontation. On one side stood old Pete Johansson, Dr. Webb, Emily McKenna, and nearly 40 townspeople who had spent the night wrestling with their consciences and emerging, determined to support justice, no matter the cost. On the other side, Judge Morrison led a smaller but more desperate faction of business leaders, town officials, and Crawford associates who saw their entire world crumbling and were prepared to fight dirty to preserve what remained of their power. The space between the two groups crackled with 10 years of suppressed truth and the growing realization that this moment would determine not just Bella's fate, but the very soul of their community. Children watched from doorways and windows, sensing the adult tension without fully understanding its source, while their mothers held them close and prayed that violence could be avoided. Judge Morrison stepped forward first, his judicial robes replaced by a plain, dark suit that somehow made him appear smaller, less authoritative. His face showed the ravages of a sleepless night, but his voice carried the commanding tone he'd used to intimidate witnesses and sway juries for decades. "Miss Rodriguez," he called out, his words carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "I've had time to reconsider the events of last evening, and I believe this community has been the victim of an elaborate deception designed to extort money from innocent families." A murmur of unease rippled through both groups. Several people who had seemed committed to supporting Bella suddenly looked uncertain, the seeds of doubt taking root in soil that had been prepared by years of deferring to Morrison's authority. Bella walked calmly to the center of the street, her bearing confident but not aggressive. She'd learned during her years in San Francisco that the most effective power was often quiet power, strength that didn't need to announce itself with bluster or threats. "Judge Morrison," she replied, her voice carrying easily despite its measured tone. "Are you suggesting that Samuel Crawford's confession last night was somehow coerced? That Dr. Webb's medical records were fabricated? That the mining safety reports documenting your friend's criminal negligence were forgeries?" Morrison's face flushed red, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Margaret Torres emerged from the crowd surrounding Morrison, her face pale but determined. She was a woman in her late 20s with the worn hands and tired eyes of someone who had borne children and hardship in equal measure. Her husband, the blacksmith, reached out to stop her, but she gently pulled away from his grasp. "Judge Morrison," Margaret said, her voice trembling but clear, "are you also suggesting that what Samuel Crawford did to me when I was 17 was an elaborate deception?" The street fell silent, except for the wind whistling through the eaves of the surrounding buildings. Morrison's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air, while the people behind him shifted uncomfortably as another crack appeared in their defensive wall. "Margaret, please," Morrison finally managed. "These are private family matters that shouldn't be aired in public. Surely we can handle this with discretion." "Discretion?" Margaret's voice rose, carrying a decade of suppressed pain and anger. "The same discretion that protected Samuel Crawford while I suffered in silence? The same discretion that convinced me I was somehow to blame for what he did to me?" She turned to address the entire crowd, her courage growing with each word. "I was 17 when Samuel Crawford cornered me in the church vestry after evening service. When I fought him off and ran home bleeding and torn, my own father told me I must have encouraged him somehow. Judge Morrison told my family that pressing charges would only bring shame on our name and destroy Mr. Crawford's reputation over what was probably just a misunderstanding." Dr. Webb stepped forward from the opposing group, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. "I examined Margaret that night. The evidence of assault was overwhelming and undeniable. But Judge Morrison convinced her parents that a medical report would only make things worse for everyone involved." The crowd around Morrison began to fragment as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Several men who had seemed prepared to support their old power structure now stepped away, their faces showing disgust and growing anger at being manipulated for so many years. But Morrison wasn't finished. Desperation made him reckless, and he played his final card with the wild energy of a man with nothing left to lose. "Even if these allegations were true," he shouted, "what gives this woman the right to hold our entire community hostage? She's demanding that we destroy our own leaders, tear apart our social fabric, all for the promise of money that may not even exist." He pulled a telegram from his coat pocket and waved it dramatically. "I sent inquiries to San Francisco yesterday. There is no Isabella Vasquez associated with any major railroad consortium. There are no pending contracts for mineral development in this territory. This woman is a fraud, using elaborate lies and forged documents to convince us to betray our old neighbors." A shocked silence fell over the crowd as Morrison's words sank in. Several people who had been moving toward Bella's side now stopped, uncertainty clouding their faces once again. The elaborate deception he described was certainly possible. Frontier communities had been victimized by confidence schemes before, and the amounts of money Bella claimed to control seemed almost too good to be true. Bella smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Morrison take an involuntary step backward. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a different set of documents, papers she had kept in reserve for exactly this moment. "Judge Morrison is absolutely correct," she said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that seemed almost predatory. "There is no Isabella Vasquez associated with any railroad consortium in San Francisco." The crowd stirred uneasily, confused by her apparent admission of deception. "However," Bella continued, "there is an Isabella Rodriguez Chen, widow of Jonathan Chen, who owns controlling interests in the Pacific Maritime Trading Company, the Western Territory Development Corporation, and the Mountain States Railroad Consortium." She held up a document bearing official seals and signatures. "This is my marriage certificate to Jonathan Chen, dated 1867. Jonathan was a Chinese-American businessman who had made a fortune in shipping and land speculation. When he died of consumption in 1871, he left his entire estate to me, along with business partnerships that span the Western Territories." The silence was now complete, broken only by the sound of wind and the distant lowing of cattle from the Crawford Ranch. "Judge Morrison, your telegram inquired about Isabella Vasquez because that's the name I've been using during my preliminary investigations. I wanted to keep my true identity secret until I was ready to reveal it, but my legal name, the name on all my business contracts and property deeds, has been Isabella Rodriguez Chen for 6 years." She withdrew another set of documents. "These are contracts signed by the territorial governor authorizing railroad construction through Blackwater Falls, contingent on local cooperation and adequate financial backing. The backing comes from my late husband's estate, which is valued at approximately $47 million. The number hit the crowd like a physical blow, even accounting for frontier exaggeration and the inflated values that characterized Boom-time investments. $47 million represented wealth beyond the imagination of most people present. Morrison's face had gone completely white. His final gambit had not only failed, but had revealed the depth of his desperation to maintain the status quo that had protected him and his associates for so long. "But here's what Judge Morrison doesn't understand," Bella continued, her voice taking on the hard edge of someone who had learned to wield power effectively. "I don't need this town's cooperation to be successful. I don't need your railroad hub, or your mining operation, or your economic development to maintain my wealth and influence." She gestured toward the surrounding mountains, where the morning sun was painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. "I could take my investments 50 miles north to Pine Ridge, or 100 miles south to Copper Creek. Either location would serve my business interests just as well as Blackwater Falls." The economic implications of her words settled over the crowd like a death sentence. Without Bella's investment, their town would continue its slow slide into abandonment and irrelevance. But with it, they could become one of the most prosperous communities in the territory. "The question," Bella said, "is not whether I need Blackwater Falls. The question is whether Blackwater Falls deserves salvation." Old Pete Johansson stepped forward, his massive frame cutting an imposing figure, even in the company of 40 other supporters. "Miss Rodriguez, what would it take for us to prove we deserve that chance?" Bella studied the crowd carefully, noting who stood where, who met her eyes, and who looked away, who seemed genuinely committed to change, and who was merely calculating personal advantage. "3 things," she said finally. "First, criminal charges must be filed against Samuel Crawford, with a commitment to prosecute, fully regardless of his social standing or past contributions to the community. Sexual assault is a crime, whether the perpetrator is a drifter or a town founder." Several people nodded immediately, while others looked uncomfortable but didn't openly object. Second, Judge Morrison must be formally removed from office and barred from any role in territorial government. His corruption of the judicial process makes him unfit to hold any position of public trust. Morrison's supporters were now a tiny minority, and even they seemed reluctant to defend his actions openly. And third, Bella's voice grew stronger, more passionate. This community must establish new institutions designed to protect vulnerable people rather than exploit them. A school that educates both boys and girls to the same standards. A legal aid society that provides representation to those who can't afford attorneys. A citizens' oversight committee that investigates allegations of official corruption. Emily McKenna stepped forward eagerly. Miss Rodriguez, I volunteer to organize the educational reforms. We could start with evening classes for adults who never had proper schooling and establish standards that prepare our children for opportunities beyond mining and ranching. Dr. Webb raised his hand as well. I'll chair the Citizens Oversight Committee. It's time medical professionals and other community leaders were held accountable for their actions, regardless of personal relationships or economic pressures. One by one, people began stepping forward to volunteer for various aspects of the community transformation Bella had outlined. Some were motivated by genuine desire for justice, others by the economic opportunities her investment would bring, but the momentum was building toward acceptance of her terms. Judge Morrison made one final desperate attempt to rally opposition. You're all making a terrible mistake. You're allowing an outsider to dictate terms to our community, forcing us to turn against our own neighbors and destroy the social order that has served us for 15 years. Margaret Torres turned to face him directly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present, including herself. Judge Morrison, that social order you're so eager to protect has served men like you and Samuel Crawford very well. But it has failed the women and children and working families who make up the majority of this community. Maybe it's time we tried something different. The crowd murmured its agreement, and Morrison's remaining supporters began to drift away, unwilling to associate themselves with a lost cause that was becoming more unpopular by the minute. Bella watched the political transformation with satisfaction, but she wasn't finished yet. She had one more revelation that would determine whether Blackwater Falls truly understood the choice they were making. There's something else you all need to know, she said, her voice carrying easily across the now quiet street. Yesterday, I received a telegram from Denver informing me that federal marshals have been investigating reports of corruption and civil rights violations in several territorial communities, including Blackwater Falls. The crowd stirred uneasily as the implications became clear. Whether or not you accept my terms for economic development, federal authorities will be arriving within the week to investigate the systematic cover-up of violent crimes against women. The choice you're making today isn't between change and the status quo. It's between leading your own transformation or having change imposed on you by outside authorities. The silence that followed was broken by old Pete Johansson's gravelly voice. Miss Rodriguez, I think I speak for most folks here when I say we'd rather clean our own house than have the federal government do it for us. A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd, and Bella felt the last pieces of her carefully planned strategy fall into place. The community was choosing justice not just for economic reasons, but because they finally understood that the alternative was far worse. Samuel Crawford appeared at the end of Main Street, walking slowly toward the crowd, with his hands empty and his head bowed. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years overnight, his confident bearing replaced by the shuffling gait of someone who had lost everything that once defined him. I came to turn myself in to the territorial authorities, he said quietly. When he reached the edge of the crowd, I've written out a full confession of my crimes, and I'm prepared to face whatever consequences the law demands. He looked up at Bella, and she saw in his eyes not the arrogant predator who had destroyed her childhood, but a broken man who finally understood the full weight of his actions. "Isabella," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know my apology can't undo the harm I've caused, but I want you to know that I've been living in hell for 10 years, knowing what I did to you and other innocent women. If my punishment can help prevent other young women from suffering as you did, then maybe some good can come from this nightmare." Bella studied his face for a long moment, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. But what she saw was genuine remorse, the kind of self-hatred that could only come from someone who had finally faced the truth about themselves. "Mr. Crawford," she said finally, "your punishment isn't mine to determine. That's for the courts and the community to decide. But your willingness to confess publicly and face consequences is a start toward the kind of accountability this community needs." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Bella individually to express support for her terms and volunteer for various aspects of the community transformation. Plans were made for town meetings, committee formations, and the practical work of rebuilding social institutions from the ground up. Emily McKenna was the last to approach, her young face bright with excitement and determination. "Miss Rodriguez, when do you think we can start seeing real changes? When will the railroad construction begin? When can we start building the new schools and establishing the oversight committees?" Bella smiled, and for the first time since her return to Blackwater Falls, it was a smile of genuine warmth rather than calculated strategy. "Emily, the changes started the moment this community chose truth over comfortable lies. Everything else is just paperwork and construction." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Bella stood in the center of Main Street and looked around at the town that had once cast her out in shame and fear. Tomorrow, federal marshals would arrive to formalize the legal processes that would bring justice for crimes too long concealed. Next week, railroad surveyors would begin planning the transportation links that would connect Blackwater Falls to the wider world. Within a year, the town would be transformed beyond recognition. But the most important transformation had already occurred. A community had looked into the mirror of its own conscience and chosen to become something better than it had been. That, a choice, more than any amount of money or economic development, would determine whether Blackwater Falls deserved the prosperity that Bella was prepared to provide. Justice, Bella reflected as she walked back toward the hotel, was not just about punishing the guilty. It was about creating a world where future victims would be protected, where truth was valued more than reputation, where power served justice rather than the other way around. The 16-year-old girl who had fled Blackwater Falls in terror and shame was finally at peace. The woman who had returned in her place had work to do, building a legacy that would ensure no other young woman would ever suffer as she had suffered in this community or any other. The circle was complete. The future, for the first time in 10 years, looked bright. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.